Mr. Orman? Mr. Pickert? Mr. Pickert? And Mr. Rolfe?
Here.
Hi, John. Okay, why don't we give it 2 minutes, and just in case folks are having technical difficulties getting in.
Mr. Pickett looks like he's here.
Hi, Bill.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, John. I'm using my cell phone today, so I apologize for technical challenges.
Oh, no problem. Super clear.
I'll tell you, I'm having trouble with mine, and I'm gonna switch over to my iPad. It worked better on the last Zoom I was on, so you'll see me coming in twice here.
John, congratulations on Baylor's success in the Big 12.
Very much. Yeah, the team back in the championship game.
Saturday should be interesting.
Well, I know Speaker Reichman is working to get logged on. I'm not sure about Mr. Orman. It sounds like President Masterson won't be able to attend today. So why don't we go ahead and get started? We don't have any action items today. We're focused on updates on where things stand with our advisory panels. And so I'm going to turn it over to our director, John Paralisi. John, take it away.
Great. Well, happy Monday, everyone. It's been about a month since we've talked as a full group, which in Spark time feels like about a year ago at this point. But anyway, we are kind of midpoint through the advisory panel process. And so thought this would be a good time to just get everyone together and give them an update on where things stand. In terms of, something that's more content oriented in terms of specifically what's coming out of the panels, I think the closer we get to the end of March, that will be, something we'll have something more definitive to share. But the other thing is I also don't want to get out in front of the chairs, who will be the ones communicating the recommendations from each one of the panels. So today we tried to kind of walk the line to try and give everyone an understanding of where things stand and kind of a flavor for where things are in each one of the panels without, taking the stage away from the panels themselves or the chairs later in the month. I'm just going to share my screen and start walking through the update. But while I'm doing that, does anyone have any questions before we get started? No? Great. All right. Can everyone hear me okay? Great, thanks. So yeah, the agenda for today, give a status update at a high level in terms of where things are, go through emerging themes from the advisory panels, once again, still a work in progress, and then talk about the next steps. And the thing I'd say is, as I walk through this, it may not take the full hour to go through all of this, but if anyone has any questions as we go, just feel free to bring them to the table as we walk through and we can talk them through. So I know that some of the Spark Executive Committee members have been on some of the advisory panel calls. And I think they would probably be able to tell you if you've been one of those calls, that we start just about every single session with going through the guiding principles that the Spark Executive Committee had put forward in terms of this process and how they're going to think about what they're seeing coming from the advisory panels themselves, so that they have this in mind. Just as a very quick, to go through it, one, prioritizing sustainable programs and investments. So catalytic investments, not things that are really going to drive ongoing budgetary requirements. That is very top of mind in terms of each one of the panels and the principles that they've put forth themselves in terms of how they think about the recommendations they're coming up with. Make sure that we're understanding the sweet spot for these funds, as well as all the sources of funds that could be brought to bear, so that we make sure that we're leveraging these discretionary funds. And the third one is super top of mind for all of the panels: foster long-term systemic impact for Kansans. So really the goal within each one of the panels has been to do a lot of work in terms of doing a data-driven situation assessment in each one of the areas to really understand the situation, where the greatest areas of needs are, as well as what the highest impact levers might be for addressing those greatest needs. In doing that, in order to provide a good amount of context as we start looking at the idea submissions, or even in some of the panels, brainstorming on ideas that go beyond those submissions to try and identify the things that can have the longest term catalytic impact for Kansas. Consider equitable opportunities and outcomes. So, we've been profiling all of the ideas so that we're able to look at them along a number of different axes. One would be geography, for instance, but there are a number of others. Enable flexibility within the investment strategies in some of these areas. For instance, on the connectivity panel, the technology so quickly, and the situation in each geography is so coming up with the right direction for how to think about investments coming out of that panel is important, while also maintaining the right amount of flexibility, given the fact that it's very complex and different situation, geography to geography, as well as just the technology and what's possible is changing pretty quickly. And then finally, ensuring results are measurable to enable tracking and transparency. And that doesn't just go for what comes out of this process, but also this process itself. So we have been, keep coming back to this as kind of our true north in every one of the sessions that we've had. Great. Just to remind folks in terms of, what we're talking about in terms of thinking about having a integrated approach to allocating the discretionary ARPA funds. We started out with $1.6 billion of funds, and the pool that we're looking at now is $721 million. There could be an opportunity for some funds to come back into that pool over time. But this has been a pretty important number for us to be keeping track of, to understand, if it's changing at all. But also it's helped give some context to exactly what the level of prioritization is that we're looking at. And you'll see in a slide or two, given the scope of the submissions, the idea submissions that received, it just shows just how important it's going to be to have some way of being able to come up with a strategic prioritization on just the most important things for the future of Kansas to focus on.
John, can I interrupt for 1
Yeah,
second
sure.
here as you come into this
Yeah,
next
go
slide?
ahead.
Leave that next slide up because it's a question as you go into it.
Yeah.
That
Yeah,
second UI trust fund replenishment of 250. I know that was going to be if needed. Are we thinking that's going to be needed, or is that going to be in play? Do we have a sense for that, or when we'll know that?
Someone may know it. I don't know that. So I can find that out though. See if
Okay.
anyone has a feel for that.
Yeah, I knew that was kind of a toss up when we looked at it before.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
I can
and the
jump
other-
in for just a minute, excuse me, John.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. So one of the things about that is it is tied by legislation to a audit review that is ongoing. And right now, based on the scope that is in play, I believe the delivery of that is probably late summer, early fall, so around the September timeframe. So as we will get a little bit more clarity around that and we can bring it back, but it may not be until that time period before we know if or how much of that 250 could move back in, which is why as we think about, kind of as I think John will talk through this process, it can be important that, as future allocated dollars come available, if there's prioritization there's still ways to move money accordingly without, having to go back and redo an entire process. So, but we'll get the specifics and share with you because it is the way that it's written in the legislation. It is tied to that final audit review.
Thank you.
I had a quick question on that slide. The FEMA money that we were hoping would come back on the extension of the testing funding, what's the status on that?
Let's see. Yeah, I don't have an update on that. We can come back on that one. Right. Continuing to go forward, and this is a repeat for folks, but this is the Spark structure that we're working within with the Spark Executive Committee at the center of it, and recommendations flowing up from the 4 advisory panels with the staff support as well as myself providing support to the advisory panels and some really kind of process guidance and definition as well as decision support in terms of feeding the advisory panels with as much information up front around the situation, as well as now that we're getting into more specific subjects, bringing experts into some of those panel discussions as well, with then the recommendations flowing up from the advisory panels, the Spark Executive Committee into the State Finance Council. And that also is an important contextual slide for this. So in terms of where we are, when we had walked through what the process looked like for the advisory panels, the goal at the start of this was to have a really broad funnel for each one of their areas. And the fact that there would be a lot of ideas and information coming into the funnel from the advisory panels themselves, brainstorming, research in other states, needs assessments, internal, external interviews, expert input, the community input, the submissions. So information coming in from a lot of different directions. And now we are working through generally in all of the panels, the phase of filtering to understand of all the ideas that have been generating and some that are continuing to be generated by the panels, narrowing that down, or at least having a way of being able to profile with the goal of then being able to have a prioritization step, being able to score the remaining ideas, and then for the panels under the leadership of the chairs to develop their recommendation to bring forward to the Spark Executive Committee early in April. So it's been a heavy lift, but we are still on track against that timeline. The thing I'd say at this point too is that this has been yeoman's work, not just for the support team, but really for the advisory panels themselves. They have put a lot of time and a lot of thought into this process. And in some of the panels, for instance, like health and education, it is an incredibly broad topic, and most of the panelists are specialists. So one of the things they've needed to do along the way is really kind of increase their knowledge base across a very broad topic area. And so the investment that they've made in doing that has, really been commendable from my standpoint. I can't say enough good things about each one of the 4 panels. So, just to understand, the kind of size of just that first step of the funnel, just looking at one source of ideas in terms of the submissions that came in. If you look across all of the panels, there are 843 submissions that amounted to about $13 billion worth of funding requests. And once again, as I mentioned before, that doesn't include all of the ideas going into the panels, because the panels themselves are brainstorming ideas as they go along. But it just speaks to the importance, and that's why that $721 million number was important before, was just the need for being able to have some prioritization. And also, having a strategic context to be able to do that prioritization against. And so I think the saying that I'd heard previously in one of these sessions is that the Spark Executive Committee panel, when they said yes to something, wanted to know what they're saying no to. And so being able to do that, means being able to do things in an integrated manner, so that when you're saying yes to something, you very explicitly know what you're saying no to. So we need to make sure that coming out of the panels, there are something like, say $1.5 billion worth of ideas. So that you're able to make those trade-offs, and then potentially, if more funds come into play later on, know what the next tranche of priorities might be to apply those funds against. And the other one is to identify those co-investment opportunities, which is top of mind for each one of the panels. So even if it's $721 million, finding ways of being able to leverage that into achieving, $1 billion worth of things, for instance, if you can find ways to be able to maximize the use of these funds and, look for ways of being able to leverage, in some instances, for instance, local and agency funds together for some things. So in terms of, just to have kind of clarity around the process, and this is partially due to the submission volume needing to be kind of strategic in terms of how we focus on this, but also just in terms of, what's going to be required in order to get to final approval of a project. Just want to have a kind of, point out up front, and if we need to have a discussion around the fact that the target output of the panels is recommended portfolios for funding at the programmatic level. Now, within those, so think of those as kind of the greatest, highest leverage areas to attack some of those needs against. Now, the submissions, a lot of those fall into, most of them will fall into those programmatic areas. So some submissions won't go forward just because their programmatic area doesn't get picked, because in the eyes of the panel, it wasn't one of the highest leverage areas to really focus on to solve the needs with this set of funds. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that the submissions will still reside within those programmatic areas, because that's important context, because when the advisory panels contemplated that programmatic area, they were contemplating, in a lot of cases, those specific submissions. So they will have been used to shape the programs and to create the recommended funding envelope, so okay, how big does that need to be? However, the specific project approval can't happen in the advisory panel context, partially because if 1.5, billion dollars of ideas collectively goes to the Spark Executive Committee, obviously they're not all going to get chosen. And from the Spark Executive Committee, it needs to go to the State Finance Council for approval. And then even after that, when you look at the submission form, they were really idea submission forms. And so they weren't set up to be able to fully reflect a project submission. And so there will need to be a procurement process that happens after that. Now, for each one of those programmatic areas that gets prioritized, the submissions still live within it. And so subject to going through the procurement process, they still exist there. But, just in terms of vernacular, just wanted to be like really clear about whether project approvals, where they would be happening in this process versus not. So I understand that this may be a bit of a different understanding for some folks. So let me stop there and just kind of open it up for conversation.
Any questions or comments for John on this point about how investment ideas will be handled?
I'd just add, I've listened in on several of the calls, and John's just done a great job leading and helping. We've been figuring it out a little bit as we go, and seeing what comes in and directing. So I just want to thank him for his work and recognize he called it yeoman's work earlier, and that's probably an understatement. So, and I also want to recognize the work of all these people who've been on these committees. So hard decisions coming up for all of us, but I appreciate them taking it in, and it's been great read through the creativity and the needs of so many hardworking Kansans too, as I've looked through the submissions. So,
yep.
Thank you, John.
I appreciate that, John. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we all second that sentiment. Secretary Burns Wallace, Mr. Pickard, anything you want to add before we move on?
I guess I would just ask, in terms of when you identify programmatic areas, how broad and vague will that be in terms of, do you have any idea what the language is going to look like? Because I'm just concerned that, at the end of the day, through all this effort and the great work of the advisory panels and you, John, that we end up with something that's not very specific. And I'm just curious as to, how you structure or how you create those programmatic areas in terms of definitions around those.
The definitions of the programmatic areas, as I mentioned, the way I view myself and the support team is we're really decision support and process support. So we've been working with the panelists to take a crack at some initial definitions around those things. But really, it's up to the panels and particularly the chairs to decide how specific they want to make the definitions of the programs. And then once again, which of the submissions they want to say are housed within each one of those programmatic areas. So it's really not up to me to define them. I think they're probably going to want to define them as specifically as they think makes sense. That's just my gut is telling me, and my gut is telling me that they're gonna want to kind of acknowledge the submissions within them that they think are the most important. So I don't see any of them getting to some specific views on things and then stepping back and making them super general, right? Because also they're going to be going in front of the Spark Executive Committee themselves and are going to need to put forth the case as to why these recommendations are ones that should be taken up by the Spark Executive Committee. So, they need to have a decent level of specificity around them.
So you think there'd be some maybe mention of some of the funding requests specifically as an explanation or an example of what they're talking about?
Oh yeah, I would think so. It would be, well, in some of them, it could end up being, well, we contemplated these 3 large submissions that we saw, but it may be that when you get into the procurement, maybe only 2 can go forward, or maybe it's these 3, and if we look at it in procurement, something else might fall into it. Maybe that makes sense. A specific case could be around in efficiency and modernization. One of the areas that it looks like they're targeting is around an upgrade or an update around some of the radios due to a change in federal requirements. And so that impacts both state and local. And so there are some local submissions. So I think they know specifically what needs to happen at the state level. On the local piece, which would probably be a cost share, they got some submissions, but it's probably a broader issue than is just reflected in the submission. So that may end up being a grant. So they're going to look very different depending upon which type of programmatic area you're talking about. Once again, I would just say that I have full confidence that I think each one of the panels is going to get to the right level of detail that they need to for each programmatic area.
John, this is Greg, Lieutenant Governor. Sorry, I joined a couple of minutes late. I actually moved to a new house, and as I was trying to log into the WebEx, I noticed the Spectrum guy outside with the cable box open, so I had to call in.
No problem. You're here.
Yeah, I've spent a little time thinking about this since you brought it up, and Bill, the question you asked was sort of one that I spent a little time pondering, and I think it would be helpful if the advisory panels came back and said, here are the general areas where we believe investment is merited and the priorities, and then specifically identified the project submissions that they felt had a connection to those priorities, so that those folks knew that as we develop the procurement process to comply with the federal requirements, that they would, potentially be, invited to resubmit consistent with whatever the federal procurement requirements are. But I think that way you're sort of using those 800 plus submissions to help guide the identification of priorities. And at the same time, sort of giving a nod to folks whose submissions were powerful in informing that decision, and also whose submissions you believe comply generally with the priority that we're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. And, I think in that way, people are going to be able to say, okay, we made it through the first hurdle. Now we've got to submit in a more formal way to meet the federal guidelines. And ultimately, it gives them, I think, the nudge that they need to continue to put the resources behind participating in the process.
Right. Well, that is the exact plan. So I totally agree with that.
Okay, any other questions for John before we move on? Okay.
Great. Just to give everyone an idea of kind of where we are in the process, as I mentioned, this has been yeoman's work, and so the panels have been, meeting very frequently, and in some cases, for a couple of them, we actually added an additional meeting in for economic revitalization and health and education, because those areas are so broad that as we wanted to start, and they had requested bringing in some experts for them to hear from around some of the areas, we just decided that we needed to split things up a little bit. And so, but anyway, a tremendous amount of work done to date over the next few weeks, a lot more coming forward. The great thing, though, is that just seeing the panels themselves kind of stretch, to take kind of ownership around those full spaces and come up to speed on a broad set of topics, and really beginning to start really honing in on the key areas to drive, and becoming pretty passionate about driving really catalytic long-term impact. We're right at that point where the panels are kind of beginning to make that turn. And it's pretty exciting to watch. And once again, I don't want to steal the thunder from the advisory panels or the chairs, but I'll give you kind of a little bit of flavor where we are. As I mentioned before, a couple of the panels are in a little bit different situation than the other two. So in connectivity and efficiency and modernization, they're a little bit farther in the process because they were a little bit more narrow in scope in terms of the breadth of stuff that they were looking at. And connectivity, it really is a pretty integrated topic. And efficiency and modernization, it is a little bit more scoped in. Economic revitalization and health and education are incredibly broad topics. And in the terms of economic revitalization, it can cover, such a wide variety of things that they're still a little bit earlier on in that filtering stage. And it's in those two where we added an additional meeting. So for instance, as we're going into the detail of defining programmatic areas, we had one session for health and one session for education, just due to the breadth as well as due to the types of experts that we bring on board to talk with the panelists. But just
John, if we could just pause for a second. Speaker Reichman, I believe, has joined us and was trying to get off of mute. Is there somebody on the tech side who can help on that?
Yes, I'm here. Who was it that needed it?
So it's Speaker Reichman.
Governor, can you hear me now?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for allowing me to jump back in. My question was the slide prior when we talk about, I think, follow up a little bit on what Mr. Orman was saying. If we have these targeted outputs from the advisory panels, who does make the final decision? Our understanding has always been, at least the SPARC would make the final decision on where the money allocates, and then approved by State Finance Council. Has that changed under this scenario?
Under this scenario, what it is basically saying is that the allocation would happen at a programmatic area, which could be defined at whatever level of detail the advisory panel decides it wants to define. That programmatic area within the program, though, would be exactly as Greg mentioned before. Here are the submissions that fell within that program that are within it, and what the ones that were used to kind of shape the program and recommend the funding. And then, but it isn't a project approval because the submission forms didn't ask for all the information that you need to go through the procurement process at this point. So it would still need to go through a procurement process later, but it would be against that programmatic definition, and including the submissions and funding that the SPARC Executive Committee would have recommended and the State Finance Council would have approved. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly. So before the final monies are gone out and check written to different organizations or entities, is that approved by the State Finance Council, by the SPARC, or somebody inside the recovery office?
Well, in terms of how it, yeah. In terms of what happens once the kind of programs are going through procurement, the way I'd envision it was that the SPARC Executive Committee would set some, context and criteria for what it means when it's talking about that programmatic area, and probably also have some oversight about what happens in procurement, subject though to meeting the federal guidelines around procurement for this set of funds. But that's a little different mode, I think, than's existed before.
Right. I just want to be cautious that before, maybe I'm saying we're talking in circles here, but before any money is given directly to end user, that entity is approved by either the SPARC and the State Finance Council, not left to just administrative only.
Mhm.
Is that how you see this, or are we going to have a conflict later?
I think that that's okay, but I mean, I think I need to get into the specifics of it. But I mean, it means that when things get past the state finance council approval and probably go into agencies, to around the program, it's saying that the Spark Executive Committee would still want to have an oversight role, right?
But we just want to make sure
For
that,
these programs.
right, all the work that the advisory panels are putting in, the work that the people on
Yeah.
those committees have put in, that's where the resources end up, and not some ways that the administration has geared off to or decided to do at their discretion.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, if you're approving something, you're approving it, with a view of what it is.
If I can jump in here. So, Mr. Speaker, I think what we need to do is at a future executive committee meeting, we'll have a discussion about this process and how this will play out. The Treasury guidance has shifted a number of times on how this has to work at the state level. And so I think there are some things that we may not know at this point. So I would ask John that we agendize this for a later conversation with the executive committee so that we're all on the same page about how the process is going to work.
Okay.
Governor, follow up on that. Has the guidance changed for what's going on in the base applications? Or is that still as planned and
It's still as planned, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, John.
I had a question. I got muted out before I could answer it or ask it rather. I was curious as to what the advisory panels are going to do or what the process is going to look like in terms of trying to prioritize situations where we've got matching local funds, fiscal recovery funds from cities and counties, as well as from private agencies. I know you indicated that the advisory panels were going to look at that, but is that something that's going to be specifically addressed and prioritized in this process, or where does that come in?
I would say in one of the overlays in the filtering that we've been applying is showing where there are some other funds that might be able to address some of the areas. And generally, that has been filtering into the thinking of the panels. And so they're saying if there are other funds that can largely address these things, they're not prioritizing it quite as much. If there's something where so it's a little bit more of, for instance, in the case of the radios, where they think there should be a cost share, they'd identify the cost sharing. So we've tried to overlay things that are in the governor, show where things in healthcare and education that are already in the governor's budget, or things that probably would be best addressed by the local split of the ARPA funds. So we've been kind of identifying those things as categories, kind of at the request of the advisory panelists.
So what I understand then is you're basically deleting requests that may have other funding associated with them altogether.
If the feeling is that funding is fairly complete in and of itself, it would probably be fair to say that probably is happening more often than not so far. But in some cases, for instance, some areas of healthcare have received a lot of funding, but needs still exist. But there are such a wealth of areas of needs that to be honest, it is kind of weighing in pretty heavily on the thinking of the panelists.
Again, I think there are probably a lot of ideas that have been submitted that we would like to see local, an investment in or as part of the state's commitment to helping a community or helping an area particularly with an economic development issues.
Yeah, to be honest, we haven't got, some of those have been somewhat deprioritized. In the area of economic revitalization, we haven't gotten to, that's kind of our next session. On that would probably be getting at some of those things. So we're just not at the point yet where we're able to really get into the details around some of those. But once again, to be honest, if there is an area that had an awful lot of funding applied to it up until now, in the minds of the panelists, it probably has contributed to them deprioritizing some of those areas.
Bill, this is Greg again. My vision of this is, consistent with what the Lieutenant Governor said. We have to have a subsequent conversation on process. And I think in that conversation, we've got to figure out how to overlay the Spark Executive Committee criteria with the Treasury guidance and the procurement process that we need to go through. Because I think what I hear you saying is, look, we want to leverage these dollars as much as possible. And so if we have a particular area where we think it's a priority based on the advisory panel work, we want to be in a position to say, apply consistent with the Treasury guidelines, providing the following information for your proposal. But I think we would also add to it those elements that make the proposal more appealing to us, i.e., are you leveraging local dollars? Are you funding this in a sustainable way? And if we layer in our requirements over the top of the shifting Treasury guidance, I think we can accomplish both things. I think we can meet the Treasury requirements for procurement, at the same time ensure that those guiding principles that have been sort of the true north of this advisory panel process get layered in as well and considered as part of the criteria in evaluating specific proposals.
Well put. I couldn't agree more.
Right.
Any other comments before we move on?
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Once again, on connectivity, and in these, I'm not looking to kind of steal the thunder of in particular, the chairs, who will, in a month's time, be presenting their recommendations from their panels directly to the Spark Executive Committee. In terms of the principles for that panel, the decision was made that the investment should align with the existing Kansas Office of Broadband Development Strategy, including the pillars. Those are the 4 pillars: infrastructure, adoption, transformative applications, broadband leadership, as well as some other principles around engaging locally, promoting collaboration, diversifying the funding sources, and that ends up being kind of project specific. The emerging areas of focus is really around the infrastructure and the adoption programs, with the thought being by the panel that you really need to get those 2 things in place, before you're focusing quite as much on the transformative applications. Those may actually come somewhat more out of some of the other panels, and they are already. The broadband leadership piece is really more about the Kansas Office of Broadband Development itself. And so the thought was this was an appropriate set of funds for anything in that area. So the panel's prioritizing the infrastructure in order to establish foundation for broader connectivity, access, and adoption. So we're working with the panel and the chairs against kind of those emerging themes at this standpoint, from a connectivity panel standpoint. On efficiency and modernization, the panel principles here are investments, really focusing probably a little bit more on the state agency program investments, somewhat prior to the local investment needs, partially because there are some local funds in a lot of cases, although not all. And also the feeling was that in order to be able to have a broader impact, focusing on some of the broader statewide programs might be more catalytic. You know, once again, in every single panel has said this, investment should avoid establishing programs that require ongoing funding, and really making sure that we understand, are there some hidden ongoing costs that we really need to understand before approving any of these? And then making sure that it's largely allowable programs and existing funding's insufficient and limited. So the emerging program areas there are around state IT infrastructure, state facilities modernization. For instance, they're decided, new facilities, not really focusing on that. Some targeted things around state continuity of operations, and then around state safety and security and local safety and security, honing in on a few areas in particular, like for instance, the public radio, or the upgrades on the radio equipment. So anyway, don't want to kind of preempt what the chairs are going to say there, but this panel in particular has really started kind of honing in on the areas that it thinks makes the most sense. Economic revitalization is chipping away at it. Once again, it's a really, really broad set of topics. This panel, I think, has differentiated itself by saying we want to be able to understand all the submissions, but at the same time, we need to take it upon ourselves to step back and really, truly understand what's going to have the greatest catalytic impact for the next 10 years, and not be prioritizing short-term point solutions. Kind of the panel's own words. Investment should be made in areas that have largely allowable programs. Existing funding is insufficient. On the allowability piece, what we want to make sure is that if there's a pathway to allowability for a great idea, we keep pushing that idea through the pipeline, and not kind of preemptively stop an idea just because it may have a little bit more difficulty in terms of the pathway to allowability. Investments should avoid establishing programs requiring ongoing funding, long-term budget requirements. And this last one, investment should fund programs with deliverables versus solely administrative oversight. I think that's kind of poorly worded. The piece that was pretty important that I'd heard was, rather than trying to, if you're able to trade off between focusing on something that is, creating something totally new to the world of Kansas versus being able to double down on some existing platforms, but helping bring them into the future, on the side of doubling down on a strength and doing something catalytic around it. Once again, if it is an industry of the future or an important platform of the future. So we've only had one of the session threes, and from that it was pretty clear areas of focus are around innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystems and platforms around that. Industry specific support, and the panel did ask to be able to have a deep dive in terms of the framework for growth from that had been created a few months ago, to get a better understanding from an industry standpoint what those might be. We had provided that as a pre-read, but they wanted to kind of hear from an expert on that. There are a couple other areas, and then workforce for sure was a big issue. Maybe not as much around training, but it was more around how to kind of make sure that that we have the workforce resources of the future that we need. Areas of panel concerns. So in water and sewer, there are a tremendous amount of submissions that came in water and sewer, both in terms of numbers of submissions as well as in terms of the amount, the dollar amount. Probably because the set of funds, sewer and water was pointed out as being explicitly allowable. Right now we're looking into what is in the works though from other funding sources around that. And then in terms of housing, with the push being that rather than trying to get involved in point solutions, are there systemic things that could be done in order to help create a better long-term solution rather than getting into the game of just trying to build housing. The areas we haven't discussed, though, are some of the targeted segments around tourism sector, cybersecurity, or some of those other enablers around infrastructure, renovations, public space enhancements. So this was a lot more of that kind of local development pieces. We haven't gotten into those areas yet. That will be later this week. Once again, this is an area, though, where I think the panel felt pretty strongly that it needed to step back and say, what do we really think, looking at the submissions, but what do we really think the greatest leverage areas are going to be that we could bring some innovation to for making a catalytic difference for Kansas. And then around health and education, this was an area where the panel had said investment should build on proven interventions and expert recommendations. So as a result of that, we've been bringing in a lot of expert inputs into the process, working with the chairs. Investment should support statewide long-term transformation versus short-term solutions. Investment should avoid establishing programs that require ongoing funding. You know, pretty much all of the panels that's squarely in their focus. And then once again, also understanding the areas that have allowable programs and where existing funding is insufficient or limited. So the initial focus has been in early childhood, K-12 higher ed, behavioral health, disability service, senior services, but the emerging themes. There are a decent amount, expressed of focus expressed by the panelists around basic needs, particularly around supportive housing, community-based resources rather than just in navigation, just thinking all about kind of state level stuff. A big theme that we spent a lot of time talking about was how to catalytically grow the healthcare workforce pipeline, because that seems to be a pretty big issue across the board, across all of those healthcare areas. Telehealth access is a big issue that's been identified by the panel, particularly around rural. And then once again, facilities expansion has been identified. Once again, none of these are the areas where people think the greatest needs are, haven't really kind of butted them up against all of the panel principles at this point. And we're going to talk about education later this week. And then it's in session 4 that we really start working through kind of prioritizing across all of these things. So once again, some honing in terms of themes, but just haven't gotten to that point yet. So that's where we are across all of the panels. In terms of next steps with the panels, we're continuing to develop, what those programmatic areas can be in order to be able to then have the panels score and prioritize them and shape those funding portfolios that they want to send up to the executive committee for consideration. And at the executive committee level, review the early advisory panel prioritization at the next executive committee meeting. Probably end of March, we'll have a little bit better understanding of where things are playing out and discuss initial portfolio recommendations in early April. I think one thing to add to this, obviously, is maybe to even sketch out, what the end-to-end process looks like, kind of extending all the way through procurement around this, so that we make sure that, kind of the right amount of adherence to Treasury federal requirements has been put in place. Maybe a little bit the right amount of flexibility is allowed in some areas, but the right types of threads and oversight exist from end to end to make sure that the intent and wishes of the advisory panel and the Spark Executive Committee extends all the way through until when funds are dispersed. So that's all I was planning on going through. Any additional thoughts, questions, concerns?
This was great, John. Any comments from executive committee members?
Hey, I was wondering, you're at the point of process of determining allowability on this stuff. Do you have any guess at this point how much is going to fall out just on an allowability from the Treasury guidance to the federal guidance?
As we looked at it, we kind of flipped the script a little bit and said rather than saying which ones are more allowable or less, really understanding which ones are always allowable versus never, versus which ones may have a pathway to allowability. So probably not as many are going to drop out from allowability, which would have been the place where it would be the most difficult issue would have been an economic revitalization. And what we've said that if the area is important enough in the minds of the advisory panel and the SPARC executive committee, if we think there's a pathway to allowability, let's try and take that pathway rather than tabling a important idea. So I don't think it's going to be actually as big a filter as we might have initially thought. It's basically we're going to fight for good ideas. So
yeah, that's great. Thank you, John. Appreciate you again.
Thank you.
John, this is Secretary Burns-Wallace. Thank you. I've been following along with various advisory panels, as you know, and listening in. Is there anything that us as the exec committee can continue to do or to help as you guys move through this final stage of the process, just making sure you have the support you need as we go through this kind of next difficult step?
No, I think we have a ton of support. Just kind of continued trust and support of the panel. Of this group, as I've said to folks, giving kind of a little bit of analogy of the construction industry where I worked. Since every single building that we built ended up in the commercial space being unique in some way or another, the only thing that we knew going into every project was that as good as the plan that we put together was, the only thing we knew was that the plan we had on day zero was going to be obsolete in some way on day one. And the thing that differentiated successful projects versus unsuccessful ones was how they adjusted. And that was just kind of the level of trust and collaboration of the team. And so, I welcome kind of and the whole team does just all the input early. And then, we'll make the adjustments as we need to go. Just trust us, we're listening, and we'll make the adjustments.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other comments? Yeah, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Mine's, it may be a little early, and if there's any other questions that we have for John, but I have a question that kind of goes back. I think I brought this up maybe 6 months ago. And that's all the ARPA funds. I think we had a little disagreement on who actually gets to appropriate those. And I noticed the governor on March 3rd issued $160 million for support for child care providers, which is part of the ARPA funds, and that did not come in front of us. Can we get some type of report on that to see what that was used for and why it didn't come in front of us, either the advisory panel, the SPARC Commission, or State Finance Council?
Mr. Speaker, I'll follow up on that.
Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to echo the sentiment, John. Thank you so much for your leadership. I think you're doing a great job, and we're really lucky to have you. And thanks for all your hard work.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks for your support. And like I said, this has been a team effort. The support team and the panels and KLRD, and there just been a number of people putting in just a tremendous amount of work against this. And so, I have met a lot of Kansans over the last few months and been impressed with every one of them. So,
well, we would expect nothing less. So thank you very much, John, for your leadership, and to all the advisory panel members, our recovery office staff, and those seen and unseen who are making this process work. We appreciate it. We are at time, and we'll adjourn. We'll look forward to the next executive committee meeting, which will be scheduled for late March. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.